I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I started an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. So I don't just make pottery, I make resources for other potters wanting to be more eco-friendly in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about sharing everything I've learned along my eco-conscious pottery journey with you. And I'm so glad you're here with me. Let's go. Hello and welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about some really simple material swaps that you can do in pottery to be more eco-conscious. In pottery, a lot of the materials are quite similar, and it is possible to kind of switch materials if one is, say like more eco-conscious than another. And that is not going to cause your clay or glaze, any major problems. So that's what we're basically talking about now. We're going to be we're talking about materials that you might be, mixing into a glaze. You might be, using in a glaze recipe. If you make your own clay, you might be using some of these in a clay. And we're just going to talk about, some very easy swaps you can make that really won't make a difference to that, much of a difference to that glaze you're making or that clay you're making. Okay, so, and these are things that I've actually tried. They're tried and tested material swaps. So I just thought that I'd tell you about them because they've improved the environmental friendliness of my pottery practice. And I'll sort of tell you the rationale for that as well. So, so the rationale is that using materials closer to you is actually it will cut down on CO2 emissions because it's cut down on the haulage and the transportation that's needed to get that material to you. So for example, if you think about, so wherever you are, there'll be local natural materials that you can use for pottery. And those will have less of a carbon footprint than if you were kind of trying to use materials from like the other side of the world, for example. So that's one of the basic sort of principles, the basic rationale for some of these material swaps. The other rationale that's used for some of the material swaps is that some materials, the way the supply chains of them are sort of less kind of cause more harm basically to sort of animals, people and the environment than other materials in the way that they're mined and sort of processed and transported. So let's get onto the materials and you'll see what I mean. So when I was first making my casting slip, feldspar was one of the key ingredients for the casting slip. And feldspar, it's also used in glazes, so this might be relevant, if you're using it as an ingredient. In a glaze, it kind of melts to this beautiful, like shiny, glassy substance in a glaze. So in the casting slip, I was like, right, I need a feldspar. I need a feldspar with a very high melting point because when you're making slip cast work, it's very prone to warping anyway, but you need a feldspar with a very high melting temperature so that when it's fired in the kiln, it sort of stops the pot from warping as much. So if you've got a lower feldspar with a lower melting point, it can just like warp your work when it's fired basically, which is like really annoying, as you can imagine. So the one with the highest melting point I found was potash feldspar. And that feldspar, like when I was looking down the list in the pottery supplier, I was looking online, I could see all the different feldspars they stocked and where they came from, basically. And potash feldspar is, the most ideal feldspar, really, for me. But that was mined in the USA. And I wondered if there was one that was like mined closer. I thought about like the kind of CO2 emissions that would take, from, basically transporting it from USA, all the way over to the UK. And I just wondered if there was a feldspar that was closer to me. And I looked down the list and I could see that there was soda feldspar, and that was actually mined in Spain. So like, pretty close. But soda feldspar actually has too low a melting point which I found out after making some pots with soda feldspar. So I found out that actually soda feldspar in a casting slip was too low a melting point to kind of withstand the stoneware glaze firing temperatures. So yeah, I had a lot of warping basically problems. So I thought, right, after that, I'm going to need a feldspar with a higher melting point than soda feldspar, but try and get it as close as possible. And then I found FFF feldspar, which is from Finland, basically. So that is the feldspar that I started using in like all my slip cast wear. So it had a high enough melting point to withstand being fired to like stoneware glaze temperatures, and it also came from like closer to me than a potash feldspar from the USA. So that's one material swap that I made. I made a conscious decision to get my feldspar rock, powder rock, from as close a source as I possibly could. Okay, so another material that this works really well with is china clay. So there's a china clay called EPK china clay. Now, just to say, they do have slightly different kind of properties, but I have switched EPK china clay out of my slip casting recipe and glazes for a different china clay called Groleg china clay, which is from Cornwall, with no major problems. So I think it really comes down to like your individual circumstances. But I switched those. So EBK china clay was like it's mined internationally, and then Groleg china clay was mined so super close to where I live in the UK. So I was like, well, why don't I use Groleg china clay and just see? I think they are ever so slightly different, but I've not noticed any difference in my work at all. So that was a really easy material swap to make. So yeah, china clay, lots of different china clays from around the world. Again, could there be one that's like closest to you? So if you live near a source of EPK china clay, then that might be a really good option for you. Or if you live like in Cornwall, right next to Groleg china clay, where that's mined, that's a great option for you too. So it really depends on like where you live, and we're just trying to basically cut down the transport of those materials getting to you. Okay, so the next material swaps are ones that are less about kind of the haulage and CO2 emissions from like transportation, and they're more just about the supply chains, for example. So we've got material swap, which is talc. So you can swap out talc and swap in dolomite. So talc and dolomite are very similar in a glaze. You can use them they've got very similar chemical composition, and you can switch talc and dolomite in glaze recipes. So say you see a really nice glaze recipe, you're like, oh, it's lovely, I want to make it. And it's got talc in it. You can switch the talc for dolomite instead. And the reason for this is talc they're very difficult to trace in terms of its supply chain, the origins of talc in terms of the way it's mined and the way it's sort of mixed internationally is really tricky. So talc is mined in different places. Some of it is legal, some of it's illegal. There's been evidence from organisations that have done research about the mining of talc and how it can be used to fund certain activities such as terrorist activities. So the illegal talc trade is a real issue for like talc sort of global supply chains. So if you wanted to kind of like avoid that, so basically talc is mixed, so you will never really be able to tell where your talc has come from. If you want to avoid that, you can use dolomite instead, and dolomite it's a much clearer supply chain with dolomite. So your pottery supplier should be able to tell you where the dolomite is actually mined, and actually dolomite is quite often mined in the UK. We've got like a good source of dolomite. So, your pottery supplier will probably be able to tell you, yeah, it's from this mine, and it's quite often, it might be even more local to you, perhaps. So yeah, so you can switch those two, and then you can also switch. So metal oxides are. I mean, I've spoken about metal oxides quite a lot on this podcast. They're one of the most, well, the least environmentally kind of friendly pottery materials out there. Basically, they're some of the ones that cause like the most kind of environmental harm, the most CO2 emissions from being mined, because they quite often have to be mined with like machinery that needs like fossil fuels, and because the ore is degrading over time. Mining companies are having to use more and more energy and mine deeper and deeper to get the same kind of amount of metal, oxides that they would need, the metal ore that they would need to make metal oxides and metal. So what can potters do about that? Because, the colouring pottery, lots of potters want to colour their work, and metal oxides are really how they do that. So there are other options. So potters can actually make their own metals from own metal oxides from recycled metal. So I've done a whole episode on this, and I do have details of how to make your own metal oxides in the book Eco-Conscious Pottery Glazing, and there's also a video course, a mini course on the Oxford Clay website. If you were interested, you think, wow, that sounds really interesting, I want to make my own metal oxides. That course on the Oxford Clay website, and also the book, goes through how to make your own metal oxides from copper and from iron. So you can make iron oxide and a kind of copper oxide called verdigris, which you can use in pottery. So both of those you can use to colour pottery. So it's really cool. You can basically take metal that's already been made, and you're turning it back into metal oxides that you can use to colour your pottery. So it's like magic. It's amazing. So you can switch those out, and yeah, I suppose you have like more limited colours you can make. So it's just kind of basically the iron would be brown, and then copper would be green in oxidization firing. But like, yeah, it's definitely an option if you wanted to maybe, supplement some of the colours you're making, colours you're using. You could supplement them with, recycled oxides that you've made yourself as well. So, so that's a really good material swap. Okay, and then the next thing that I tried in my pottery practice was that when I was making casting slip for the first time, in lots of the books, when I was reading the recipe, it needed this thing called soda ash. And I knew just from reading about just different pottery materials that soda ash, the process to make soda ash can be quite sort of environmentally damaging. So I just wondered, I thought, what is this soda ash doing in pottery? I didn't really know what it was for, what it was doing in the casting slip. And I just wondered, well, I wonder if I could just like take it out, because you hardly needed any, in the casting slip. I just really didn't know, what it was doing. I already had a deflocculant, which is the chemical that makes your slip like really runny, and then I was adding the soda ash as well. So I thought, like, maybe if I could just remove the soda ash, and so I did. I basically just removed it from my casting slip, and it was kind of exactly the same. So I thought, this is great. I don't have to buy soda ash. I don't have to, sort of worry about this kind of where the soda ash is coming from. I don't have to, be purchasing this soda ash from this, supply chain with causing potential harm to the environment and stuff. I can just literally, I don't have to use it. So yeah, I completely removed it. So that's another thing to think about. Could you just remove something from your pottery practice? Is there something that you're using that you can take away, and you don't even, it doesn't make any difference to your pot, basically. That's a possibility as well. Yeah, okay, so let's just summarize the material swap episode, and can you make some, can you swap some materials out to be more environmentally friendly in your pottery practice? Perhaps you can, perhaps you can't, but here are some ideas, just to get you thinking about it. So can you swap any materials that are mined far away for materials that are mined closer to you? So things like, for example, feldspar could be, there's lots of different feldspars. Could you pick one that's closer to you? China clay, there's different China clays. Could you again pick one that's like the closest to you? Can you switch commercial metal oxides that you've bought from the pottery supplier? Can you switch them for like making your own metal oxides? Which is really fun process from recycled metal. And can you remove anything from your pottery practice? Is there something you're using that you maybe don't even need, and you could just save all that time, resources, money, and just like take it out of your pottery practice? So, for example, soda ash. So like it's been so great to have you on this episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Hope this has given you some ideas of things you can do, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you on the next episode. And until then, very happy potting, and I'll see you then. Bye. So if you enjoyed that and you're interested to learn more about eco-conscious pottery, head over to the Oxford Clay website, which is www.oxfordclay.co.uk. I can't wait to see you there.